He's been an assistant district attorney in the past and has his own thriving law practice. He is also a member of the City of Peekskill's Common Council, and he is a candidate currently to be the new county legislator for Westchester District 1, which covers Peekskill and parts of Yorktown and Cortland. And he is running against a Republican opponent who's a former mayor of Peekskill. Please welcome Colin Smith. Next, I'd like to welcome Brezler. She's an elementary school teacher and a progressive advocate. Her work has included fighting for fiscal equity in the New York State budget, fighting against standardized testing, and military recruitment in schools. She's a pacifist. My word, not hers. More recently, she entered electoral politics, campaigning for the New York State Senate seat that was when it was vacated by George Latimer, and then stepped aside for Shelley Mayer. And then she fought a hard-fought fight for City Council in White Plains. Please welcome Brezler. Last but certainly not least is our friend Hezi Aris, and I say our friend because Hezi is the publisher and editor of the Yonkers Tribune. He is also host of the radio show Westchester on the Level, and they have been a supporter of the Ossining documentary series for years. We started off, I would go on his radio show for an hour every month, and half of that was to talk about the upcoming screening that would be happening later that week, and we still do that. And then we've added more times to talk about things happening in Ossining and the bigger government picture throughout Westchester and New York State. Hezi's focus is largely on municipal government in Westchester County, and in fact, his investigative reporting has led to 3 recent lawsuits. I don't know if that'll come up this evening, but involving the president of the Yonkers PBA, a deputy chief of the Yonkers PBA, and a retired Yonkers Police Department detective who currently works for the New York State Attorney General. So please welcome Hezi Aris. We've been mixing up our format a little bit recently, so folks who are regular attenders here at the documentary discussion series will recall sometimes I'm running around with a microphone, sometimes we've had some guest moderators. I'm not a guest moderator, but I'm sitting down as moderator for the first time, and we have some questions that have already been submitted, and people are handing me more questions. So actually I'm going to hand these to members of the committee, and they're going to sort through them and then hand me a few as the program goes on. So if you have some that you'd like us to take a look at, and then maybe we'll get to just as many as we can. And that's part of the reason we do this, is to incorporate as many questions as we can so we can hear as much as possible from our panelists. And panelists, when you use this microphone, which is on, you can see how close I'm holding it to my face. It's uncomfortably close, but that's really necessary with this system for when we hear us. Okay, so there's so much we could delve into in this film. Let's start with talking about voter suppression. This was really focusing on the systematic voter suppression that's become a problem institutionally. I will just point out that anybody here who is a voter and goes to the polls might have questions about exactly what's going on at the voting booths and how that works. In fact, is there anybody here who is been a poll worker? Because I know Charles Schiller has. Yeah, very good. Thank you so much for being a poll worker. That is really difficult work. It's a very long day. You show up and do it once or twice a year, and there's a lot to be able to manage for that day. So thank you very much for participating in that way. And for the most part, I think poll workers do a very admirable job, and it's very hard work. Although there's even some questionable behavior by a poll worker here in Ossining in last year's primary. It all worked out just fine, but that poll worker's no longer with us. As a worker, probably in the world. But what we really saw in this film was the systematic voter suppression, and talking about voter security, and Mitch McConnell, obviously, who has such an incredible amount of power in Washington, D.C., has been the recipient of contributions from lobbyists for the 2 largest vendors of voting machines. And coincidentally, he has blocked the Senate from voting on election security bills. So why do you think this story has received so little attention? And I'm going to tie that into the press in general, and Hezi, you might want to jump into this. You know, it's very difficult for us to get news that is from outlets that do not have corporate interests that are really sort of dictating what can be there and what stories can be told. And you're somebody who does that a lot on the local level. So I'd be interested from hearing from any of our panelists about where do you get your news that isn't distorted by corporate interests. So,
anyway. Well, I know for example, with what I do with the Yonkers Tribune, thank you. We don't get corporate funding, and in a sense that makes it difficult in some situations. But somehow or another, we've been able to just have enough so that we can actually do the work. And it takes time to build credibility, especially with small local publications. And eventually, once you build that up, and your stories become credible because there's logic to it, and it gets revealed again through other places, replicated. Eventually, then it becomes a credible operation, and that's when you get sued. I had to go to Supreme Court today in White Plains, so I was nodding off a little bit because I started my day very early, and so I'll be up like around 18 hours today. But the truth is that the other side, who was suing me because they really wanted to shut me down, did so by taking one case and a second and a third, and they spread it out 1 month apart, the same lawyer, and it turned out it was just to shut it down and shut the paper down. But I think they failed because even today they didn't show up, and they wanted to postpone it all the way until November. So my lawyer, Michael Sussman, is going to push through, and we're going to try to really get it done right away.
Just as a point of interest, Michael Sussman, that's the former candidate for Attorney General.
Absolutely. Same one.
And the one that did the desegregation case in Yonkers.
Yeah.
And Legoland.
Yeah. Right.
He actually used to have an office here in Ossining. We have a mutual friend. Yeah, very good. Okay, sorry, we went on a little tangent there, but I guess it's a small world of progressive political interest.
I feel like Hezi didn't give himself enough credit in this, because the reason why Hezi doesn't have to consume a lot of independent media is because he's always on the spot. I mean, he does the work. That's why not only are you in this now, but Mayor is also, the previous mayor, putting in your outlet also had a problem. I mean, being primary resource is clutch when so much of the deep fake news is happening. I didn't mean to jump in there, but I'm a big fan of Hezi.
Thank you.
So does anybody, beyond Hezi, who really focuses on local politics, are there resources that you feel are really valuable for getting some of these stories that are not covered as well?
So I think that you heard Penny talking about this when she did a bunch of those post-its. It's really hard to follow these cases, which is why it's harder for news outlets to cover, because you have to really get in there and learn a lot about it. What we see happening with the Caban case and Katz out in Queens is that there's just so many moving parts, and you've got to keep threading the needle, and people have busy lives, and they're working class, and defending your democracy is like a full-time job, and having to support independent journalists and news outlets, it's exhausting.
I can say that I'm not a journalist. I'm actually an attorney by profession, but this is certainly not my area of law. I do criminal defense and matrimonial, which you do a fair amount of investigation in that, but it's different. It's not journalism per se. I tend to be one of those mainstream media guys in terms of what I might go to for news. I watch the local, the News 12, and I tend to go to CNN for the political discussions. That said, I find that there's a number of local sources that can really delve into some of the local issues in depth because of their context, because of their proximity to the events. But just to kind of answered, I think, the original question, correct me if I'm wrong, was why do you think the news media, as was stated in the movie, is not covering this story or this system? And I don't really have a terribly good answer for that, other than to say because of the detail and the moving parts and just kind of the card game, the shell game that you know these moneyed interests are able to really play. It makes it difficult, and it's a risk. You know, it's a risk for I think the larger networks. Not to say that it's a risk not worth taking, but I think that you know, mainstream media tends to shy away from the more risky stories, especially when there's such a strong narrative against something like this, which, you know, wants to make this guy out to be like some type of conspiracy theorist or what have you, even though he clearly, apparently has, you know, a lot of facts on his side.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add something. One of the problems is that, or one of the realities is that we live here, wherever that is. So if it's Ossining or Yonkers or a small municipality, and that really impacts everybody's life very, very intimately. Maybe more so than on the national level or even on the state level, even though they all impact everyone. But the reality is that the difficulty for maybe mainstream media or larger media that has a lot of corporate money to get engaged in something is because they're bucking the trend. It's very difficult to fight the local community because they're all there clinging desperately for the leader or the mayor or whatever. And there's, you know, that's the thing that I always found compelling about Ossining and Mayor Garrity. There's a transparency and a demeanor in her that I've recognized that is just superlative, and it's unique today. And what's unique about it is that she doesn't contend with issues in a very autocratic way. When you look at cities like Yonkers, when you look at cities like Mount Vernon, they're collapsing. They have dismissed the public interest, and now they do what's good for them. And that identity politics is what's ruining people and the situation in communities, because they're no longer working for the public interest. They're working for themselves. And then the only way to get to that is to challenge them and to show and expose what they're doing. Like we had 33 guys and women who were probation officers in the police department today. 3 of them were going to be members of the mayor's family. And they had what do you call it, a legacy of stealing from their own company, from their parents' company, Spano Oil, and more. They have a legacy of corruption in Mount Vernon, in Yonkers, in Pleasantville, in so many other places. And if we didn't expose it, they would have been hired. They're not hired. And that's the bottom line. That's what we do.
Well done. I love Hezi.
You know, so much of our conversation on the national scale recently has been related to just tweets, but just racist policies and comments. It's pretty unusual that the U.S. Congress would pass a resolution calling out the president's comments to be racist. That was surprising. I've recently been in contact with Congresswoman Lowy's office. She reached out to me, and I'm sure other local leaders in her district, in anticipation of this last weekend's potential raids that had been threatened. And also in speaking with her staff, learned more about her plans to visit a detention center in Florida. And I'm forgetting the name of the particular center, there are so many, but this one is just for children. Now, folks may be aware she's the head of the Appropriations Committee, so she's responsible for knowing how the federal dollars are spent, and some of the dollars are spent at this detention facility, which, lo and behold, is a for-profit detention facility, and one of the owners of this and a number of the facilities is John Kelly, which is a name you may recall because he's the former chief of staff for President Trump. And I mentioned that now in relation to one of the questions that we had, which again ties us back to Homeland Security. In the film, we saw Chris Kobach. He was interviewed at the Republican picnic, if you'll remember, and he is the gentleman with Crosscheck, which was such a focus of this film. He's also an advisor to Trump on immigration and a potential head of Homeland Security. So with what's happening now on the border and all the increasing institutionalized racism, what should people be doing to resist?
Well,
This
this
is
is,
not there. There's
well,
lots of
there
that.
is.
You can pick out whatever
So,
you want.
you know, I have been watching Greg Palast do these films since I was in college, and I realize that I'm a younger person in the crowd, but that's still the last 16 years of my life. I screened this film when I was in undergrad and we were going to war. And not this film, I screened another film in this series. So we have been fighting against this kind of voter purging and suppression, and watching the way that Crosscheck might migrate over to DHS, and how, I mean, we just saw the double for more than 800,000 Garcias. I could only imagine what that would look like for DHS. I mean, it would have an even higher ratio if you picked a similar last name. So I think that what we need to do to get to a more secure place is move to a different kind of IDing system that isn't that kind of automated, where it's using the last name, or I think that we should be using voter IDs. It's a long number that corresponds with me and it's followed me my whole life. So you could find out where, when I voted in what election. And that's what we should be using to follow. It's different than a social security number. And it's different than using a fingerprint, and it's different than using a signature. Neither one of those last two mentioned things are a very good idea and have been debunked over multiple studies. So I think that moving towards that kind of voter IDing system, where it's a series of numbers and codes that's linked to each individual. But that seems like more of your
Can we ask from the floor a comment? I did.
Well, not exactly, but I appreciate the
Vote of confidence.
vote of confidence there. This actually isn't necessarily my wheelhouse, but before I respond, I just want to recognize my colleague, Vanessa Agudelo, councilperson for the city of Peekskill, in the audience. It's good to see you there, Vanessa. The question, I think, was, what can we do to resist? So, I mean, from what I've seen over the course of the last, let's just say several months, there's been a number of ways, I think, that people have expressed their opposition to the immigration policies of our government, through things like attending protest rallies, through going to D.C., going to rallies in D.C., attempting to speak with members of the Congress, writing from home. I think we as elected officials have access to other ways to do that. And just as recent as this past weekend with the ICE raids that were taking place throughout the region, I know that in Peekskill we had basically authorized or instructed or authorized the city to make a notification to people through our Code Red system that was not utilized because I just don't know that the city was necessarily ready to take that step, or that there was enough information for them to feel confident in taking that step. But it was something that we as officials felt was at least in the interest of our citizens, to the extent that ICE wasn't attempting to execute criminal warrants, which is a bit of a different matter. So I think that that's one way that as elected officials you can resist. But even doing something like that is not without its risks. I don't think, and quite frankly, I think it remains to be seen as local and even county municipalities participate in that type of activity to protect the citizenry. It remains to be seen if at some point the federal government kind of strikes back at that. And, we'll see.
Getting back to sort of the core of this film, which is talking about voter suppression. The latest question I was just handed is, how do we expose and fix this problem? Is there any hope?
Well, there is. Like, I know, for example, in Yonkers, we had a real problem. Sometimes the police or the fire department were standing before the polling stations where people would come to vote, and they said, no, you can't vote here. It's been moved over somewhere else. And that's how they used to dissuade people from voting. And until that was noted, it was just not, it was like underground. Nobody wanted to believe it, but that was the case. The thing is that if we don't tell the public what's happening on the local scene or on the larger scene, then we're actually assisting government to silence the public. Because if you look at it, while there may be News 12 and the Journal News and maybe other publications, certainly the New York Times and the Daily News and the New York Post and others, and other online media and television, the problem is that we don't engage the public. We assist their being silenced by the governments that actually oversee them. And there's no media, and that's the problem. It's really a barren wasteland here when you think of Westchester County, that you would think such sophisticated people, so much professionalism, and so much wealth, and there isn't that much information coming out. And that still goes back to the same old thing, like for someone like Mayor Garrity, if you have a demeanor at the top, that's the leadership role that you need. And the one at the top will tell you how the rest of the community will move ahead. So you have to be open, you have to be inviting, you have to be just willing to hear. And if that's the case, it changes the attitude. But if you look at a city like Mount Vernon, the whole place is collapsing before us. We're going to have five months of total horror, of people being hired, people being fired, nobody knows who's who, people being arrested. We've got the courts not making a decision, the district attorney not making a decision, and it goes on and on. And that undermines the public. That's the problem.
And the more people that watch, the more people that watch the process, the better. So if I can invite any of you in to participate in petitioning, participate in voter registration, participate in getting people to the polls, the more people that are actively engaged and the more people that are voting, the harder it is to hijack elections at the margins. So when you become your own citizen journalist and you are reporting to the couple hundred people that may follow you on Facebook or that you can engage with a local reporter, that changes the landscape in microcosms, and you're only 4 degrees of separation from any one person on Facebook. Just think about it.
Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, I really think there's a much better way to do this, and it's to raise the issue of voter suppression nationally to a moral, ethical issue led by clergy. I'm old enough to remember, and this film ended with a quote from Martin Luther King saying, "Who will march with me?" Right. I remember clergy, arm in arm, ministers, priests, rabbis, not too many Muslims 50 years ago. But I think if this is elevated, you have to have the clergy. I think that makes an enormous difference. We live in a world of confirmation bias. People are going to watch news that feeds into their already predetermined attitudes. But I really think if this has to be raised to not a political issue, above that, higher, a moral, ethical issue, and the best people to do it are clergy, and they're AWOL.
Do you know, well, so I think that that's interesting. Who in here knows who Reverend Barber is? Okay, good. All right, so there are clergy that are involved. Who also knows in the county where you have the highest density of churches?
Feels
Well,
like
I wanted
Mount
to add,
Vernon.
yeah, Mount Vernon. I wanted to add something to that because just what Kat said. In Mount Vernon, for example, the church is the backbone of the entire community and very powerful, but at the same time,
May I have your attention,
government.
please? The library will be closing in a half hour. Please note that the computers will be shutting down in about 15 minutes. Please save all your work.
Well, the government in Mount Vernon also pays every pastor, and every priest, and everybody who is in houses of worship. They get paid a stipend of $15,000. $15,000 each. We have the same crisis going on in Yonkers, and it's not that our clergy is deficient, but they are also desperate for money in order to help their flock to function. And that's the problem. Money has become, the thing that actually undermines people's capacity to govern.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Mommy,
So
Mommy.
I really think that's the root, that's the root of where we are right now. Money is at the heart of everything. What do we do to get money totally out of politics once and for all?
Thank you. I just thank you very much for your question. You did really cut to the heart of it. If folks didn't hear that, is really money and greed is at the root of everything we're talking about today, and so much of the corporate takeover of our country, which is leading to this voter suppression. I do want to say about the format that we have today. We were experimenting with a little different format, and we do have a number of questions here from folks. So let's try and stick to that. And please, Ms. Colin, you're going to express something with the last topic.
Let's move on.
Okay, well, so some of the this really did focus primarily on Republican active suppression of votes, and that is what we're seeing on a national level. One person asked, the problem is not only Republicans, but establishment Democrats have chosen to blame Russia with no credible evidence. The point they were making is voter suppression doesn't benefit only Republicans, but also establishment Democrats. Go Bernie and Tulsi. Continue, the related question is voter suppression done totally to benefit the Republican Party? Does anybody know?
No.
It goes both ways.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it goes to totally.
In your race, it's the Democrats are always in the right, right?
I don't know if it goes to totally benefit the Republican Party, but it certainly seems to, by and large, benefit the Republican Party. And I think one of the, the issues that he came back to a couple of times in the movie was showing how in the suburbs, the lines for the voting, for the polling place, there was no line. And then when you got into the downtown area, people were waiting, 10 hours to vote. I mean, there's so much there, and I think that a big part of the, and we've seen this throughout the South more and more recently, especially since 2013 with the basically the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, Shelby versus Holder, is that county governments are basically putting their they're putting their polling places where at the behest of the political leadership. And the places that are, and it's not just in places that are, predominantly Republican. It's all over the place, and I think that there has to be a concerted effort to equalize, to make that the playing field, so to speak, fairer and more equal, because whole portions of our society, of our population, who are largely minority and poor, and are disenfranchised solely based on the fact that there's, they don't have the options when it comes to vote. They have to wait in line, they have to travel 50 miles, whatever the case might be. I'm happy that in New York, we now have early voting this year for the first time, and that's going to be, I believe, a great benefit, just in general to our democracy. democracy, to our voting system, but particularly to those groups which have, traditionally been disenfranchised as a result of just one day of voting.
I can recall just in this last primary, two disabled people who were trying to vote, telling their story. One person who's over 80 years old was reluctant to go to the polls because they had gotten a ticket last year, and that ticket was $150. And they were able to argue it down to $20. Still a poll tax, and also it was not her fault. There were no handicap parking available. My mother got a ticket early or absentee voting a year or so ago, parking in front of the Board of Elections, and somebody reported the ramp was not ADA compliant, and the wheelchair flipped over on him. I mean, he's okay, but this is the struggle of the most disenfranchised among us, and hopefully that early voting does make a difference. Having those 10 extra days to have access to a poll where you're not struggling, you're not in a rush for a parking spot, but historically it's been bad.
I like the idea of what happened in the last few years. Let's say for the last 25 years, we used to have big donors who would give thousands of dollars to any particular campaign. It didn't matter who, Republican or Democrat or something else. But what's interesting is that all of a sudden it's become acceptable to maybe give a $3 donation or a $5 donation. It's respected. Those numbers add up to a lot of people, and they vote. And their capacity to make a donation is as crucial as the one that's going to give 1,000 or 5,000. It would be great if we would have people in leadership who would actually try to present a different dynamic as well. And that is something like in Britain, for example, they have a short, truncated election process. It's 2 months long. There's a maximum amount of money that they get from the government, and it's not a lot. And that's it. It's over, it's done with, it's finished, and everyone has the same opportunity. I think the only issue then, I guess, is how many people are allowed to enter into the race, and then some people may be disenfranchised for whatever reason. But then you also, you find here locally that many people enter a race, and they have no clue on how to put together a campaign. Oh, here I am, no money, no team, no nothing, no prospect, and you wonder, well, what are they trying to do? Are they validating the candidate who does have that? And that's the problem. We have a lot of false gods or goddesses, and they can't go anywhere.
Well, Colin just whispered to me when you were saying that we all start out not knowing anything about how to run or enter a campaign, and hopefully we find some really thoughtful, wise, experienced people to help us get into that process. So I'm going to ask this question, and then we'll have gotten through most of the questions or some version of the questions that were submitted. If I know that a few people really wanted to speak, so I'm going to take 2 final questions from the audience. So if you want to be one of those final questions, try to use this time while we're talking to make a concise question. And Charles, you already got to ask your question. Okay, so can you speak to the connection between the racist rabble-rousing and the influence of big money? Is there more to it than just distraction? So I'll ask again, can you speak to the connection between the racist rabble-rousing and the influence of big money? Is there more to it than just distraction?
So I meant to start out with a quote from Ayanna Pressley the last time we were talking about this. Those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And for too long, the table has been flipped the other direction. Those with the most access and the least, all of the enfranchisement, are those that are making the decisions. And that's why it looks the way that it does. If somebody who has struggled to have access to housing or to transportation or to clean water were to be enfranchised and empowered to the ability that they're now making laws and advocating with a much larger platform, the things begin to change and shift a little bit, and that's, I think, what we're seeing. We're seeing the height of sexism and racism and phobias galore because that's their only tool.
Well, I concur with that as well. We need to show the public the relevance of particular issues. And if someone is a racist or has a problem with some people or religions or whatever, they need to be called out. But it needs to be clear. That's one of the problems. One of the problems with the president is he may have some lucid ideas, but he doesn't explain them well. So you need people who can explain things in a clear way so that people do understand and they can connect to it. And that becomes very relevant. I got a press release from somebody a couple of days ago, and he said there was money being directed to particular hospitals by this legislation that passed on in the House. And I said, well, which hospitals? Why does it matter? You didn't tell us how it's going to affect us. So if we know that it's going to affect a particular hospital in our community, it matters. And if it affects only other communities and other hospitals that are 50 miles away, it may not matter so much. So what is it that you're trying to do? And that's the problem. We don't really have a story, and the story is important. And it's not all up here. You have to connect it. And that's one of the problems today, I think. We don't connect it.
Can you just read that question?
Sure.
Can you speak to the connection between the racist rabble-rousing or the racist rhetoric, however it's delivered, social media or otherwise, and the influence of big money? And is there more to it than just a distraction?
I mean, I'm not sure what the exact connection is, if there is one, but I think that if we take our current president as an example, long before he was, President Trump, he was, the Donald, and he's got a history of using race to his advantage, whether it's to, exalt himself in the media, whether it's to, get out of a pending lawsuit, or what have you. And I think that he kind of typifies the way race has typically been used in this country for political and financial gain. So I think what we're seeing now is certainly a resurgence or an uncovering of a lot of the racist sentiment that exists in our society, a lot of the sexism that exists in our society, and quite frankly, I think it provides a very convenient way for this president and for the people who take his position on things to kind of divide and conquer. Although I don't particularly like that phrase, but it's the only one that comes to mind, because it tends to keep the opponents on their heels, fighting over what he just said, and even from his his most recent tweets over the last weekend, he can easily drive a wedge into the fabric of our social conversation, and in that regard, I suppose it's a diversion, but it's and unfortunately, that's the history of it in this country.
All right. I'm just remembering this clock is actually a couple of minutes slow, so raise your hand if you think you have a question that would really help wrap up our thoughts today and get to the heart of something that we haven't covered yet. Yes?
Do you think that the demographics of the voters over the next 20, 30 years, the shift, where the younger voters stand now on issues, coupled with recent history of enormous increase in women being elected to public office at all levels, gives people hope that maybe politics can clean this act up?
I want to make sure that we still understand that we are still vastly, vastly underrepresented as a population size. We've done well at the New York State Senate side, and we've done well at the county ledge side, but in no way have we really dented the glass ceiling on the congressional or Senate side. We're still only 20% when we're more than 50% of the population. But I think what's less relevant in gender in a younger generation is more capital interest. I think that there's less and less hysteria over deficit and more focus on climate, because when you're underwater, you can't breathe money.
Okay, and actually one of the last questions that we received from our audience member was what percentage of the suppressed votes are women? The voter suppression that was highlighted here was very
May I
much
have your
focused on
attention, please?
race.
The library will be closing in 10 minutes.
Women
If you have
vote
any
more.
items you wish to check out, please bring them to the circulation desk now. The library will be open tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Thank you and have a good evening.
So, go ahead. You're saying it's more.
More women vote more, and so we show up more on the list. I don't know what.
We do vote more than, we are more than 50% of the active voters in the electorate, yes.
And we vote more in primaries also. We're
Good.
just more active voters.
Okay, so they're not suppressing us very effectively. That's their goal.
Some of us more than others.
Okay, then I just want to, I want to allow all of our panelists to provide us with a final thought, something that came to mind that maybe wasn't expressed tonight, or just any inspiring word that you can share with our audience before we can see both. No pressure.
You know, I think that I was impressed with the way the last 10 or 15 minutes of the movie just kind of focused on the historical, fight for voting rights, here in this country, and how that, ties into the theme of this documentary about, the influence of money and the power brokers who stand to benefit and to gain behind the scenes. But I think we have to, one of my frustrations is when and I don't know to what extent this prevails nowadays, but there's a disillusionment with politics and with the political process, and I think it cuts across, all the demographics, but I've seen it more in some of the younger generations, and while I know some very active, politically active people who are much younger than I am, and that's great to see. There's a lot of people out there who feel as though their vote doesn't count, that it's not important, that it won't, not that it's not important, but that it won't make a difference, and therefore why bother? And that's why I think it's important to understand the history of the struggle for many of us, for most of us in this country at least, to get to the place where we have the right to vote. I mean, we've always had the right to vote. Technically, it's just never been. It's taken a long time for this country to recognize that right, and that's an important right, and its importance will never diminish for as long as we want to continue with our democracy.
If you care about election integrity, and you should get more involved. Queens is going through a DA race, and they're separated by 14 votes. Every vote matters. These absentee ballots matter. If, like I said, if election integrity is something that matters to you, know how to check your registration status, know how to teach other people how to check their voter registration status. Always keep voter registration on you. As a hawker of democracy, I encourage you all to do that, to practice voter registration, because nobody's ever as up to date as they think they are on their voter registration. You find it out election cycle after election cycle, and everybody needs a hand. So if you can pitch in either calling to get voters out, democracy is terribly out of shape and it needs to be exercised, so help us.
I concur with the ideas that have been brought forward. I think what's interesting about voters today is they're learning that it's important that they do vote. And the reason they recognize it's important to vote is because their vote counts, not by their personal name, but it's recognized that if a certain number of people vote from a certain district, then that's the district that's recognized by whoever the power that be, whether it be a Westchester County legislator or a mayor or a senator or whatever. And all these things matter, and they don't know who you are personally, but if 50 people vote in your district and only 5 people vote in another district, they're going to pay attention to the 50 people who voted. So that's the correlation that we need to drive home, the importance of that. You talk about the census, it will matter. It will also matter how much money comes to a particular community if everyone gets counted. So it's important to bring that home, and that's the connection. And once that's recognized, the money will actually pay back the deficiencies of the past, maybe remedy that to some extent.
Thank you so much to our panelists, and you brought up, in the final words here, you brought up a couple of really important things. The census is something you're going to be hearing us so much about in the next year, and we've already started having our meetings in our community for a complete count committee, as well as some other communities in Westchester have gotten that underway. And voter registration, you should know, New York State has made some progress in our New York State voter laws, but one thing we are not good at, in fact, we're one of the worst, is how far in advance you need to register to vote. And particularly if you're interested in voting in the Democratic primary in 2020, you need to be a registered Democrat by mid-October of 2019. So if you're currently unaffiliated or a member of another party and you're interested in having a voice in the Democratic candidates, you need to do that voter registration now. And I'm so embarrassed I don't have my voter registration cards with me now. I often do. My husband keeps them behind the bar that he owns in town. We do voter registration drives. I go to senior communities to do voter registration drives, and here I am without any forms. So I don't know, Kat, you have any with you today?
I probably do.
Okay. Very good. So maybe Kat can help us out with that. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. Thank you to all of you. We look forward to seeing you in September. Enjoy our hiatus in August. We'll look forward to seeing you in public.
Likewise. Yes. You guys should. Hold on.